Well, hi everybody and welcome. My name is Neil Seidman and I'm the co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. That's the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And we're really happy to present this webinar, Anxiety, Depression, and the LGBTQ Community, Thriving Through the Challenges. And our presenter is Dr. Debra Hope. Now we're going to be recording the webinar, so you'll have a chance to see it again on the ADAA website. And before we get started, I just want to say just a little bit about ADAA, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. ADAA was started back in 1979. And today it's the leading nonprofit organization in the field of anxiety and depression. And our mission is to improve diagnosis and to promote the prevention, treatment, and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, like this webinar, through practice, and through research. We work to end stigma and to get the word out that these conditions are real, they're serious, and very treatable. And I want to especially invite you to visit the ADAA website. It's a really wonderful resource. That's adaa.org. And you can support ADAA by making a charitable donation on the website. Okay, so let's get started. Now, during the webinar, excuse me, we want to invite you to type in your questions. So if you look on the right side of your screen, you should see a Q&A panel. And there's a little field at the bottom of that panel. When you click in it, you can type in your question. Then either hit your Enter key or click the icon. Now, only Dr. Hope and myself can see your question. So as we go, please feel free to type in a question. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So I'm really happy to introduce our presenter. Dr. Debra Hope is professor of psychology, and she's the director of the Anxiety Disorders Clinic at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Her research focuses on anxiety disorders and the mental health impacts of stigma and discrimination. So let me turn it over now to Dr. Hope.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that nice introduction, Neil. And I'd like to thank ADAA for the opportunity to present this webinar. And my appreciation to Neil for hosting today and taking me through all the technology things. So that's been very helpful. All right. So just a generic, I have no conflict of interest to report slide. LGBTQ issues are all around us right now. And if you pick up a newspaper or walk by a magazine stand, click on the internet, you will certainly see something related to LGBTQ people and civil rights and court cases and people coming out. It feels like it's all around us. Perhaps many of you saw the Bruce Jenner interview with Diane Sawyer, which was a week ago Friday now, I believe, in which he talked about being transgender and talked about coming out over the next few months or a year, and sort of that, everything that's going on with him around that. A couple of years ago, you see a cover from Sports Illustrated here. Jason Collins comes out as the first athlete in a major professional sport in the U.S. to come out as gay. Made big news for a few weeks then. And then here's a screenshot from Chaz Bono's website. And Chaz Bono, some of you may know as formerly Chastity, the child of Sonny and Cher, of Dancing in the Stars fame, who's been a very famous and important spokesperson for the transgender community. So I'm going to start off here with some definitions. As some people say to me when I'm giving these presentations, so what do all those letters mean? LGBTQA, and it seems like we're always adding another one to the list. So let me start off first with the LGB portion of it. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual refers to sexual orientation, which means who are you attracted to, who do you want to be a partner with. The T stands for transgender, which refers to gender identity, and gender identity is your sense of yourself as masculine or feminine or different, perhaps elements of both of those. I use transgender really as an umbrella term for anyone for whom gender is not really the binary of male, female. The gender that you were assigned at birth is the one you continue with through your life. So it includes people who wish to change their body to match the gender they feel inside, like Chaz Bono. Q refers to queer or questioning, and it can refer either to gender identity or sexual orientation. I'm getting some feedback here, so...
Yes, we're having a problem with our audio, unfortunately.
Okay.
So if everyone can just bear with us, Dr. Hope and I will rejoin you in just a minute.
Okay.
And Dr. Hope, let's hang up our audio and call back on the audio.
Okay.
Okay.
That means we're supposed to...
I'm back.
Are we back?
I can hear you.
Okay. So we're back. Thank you.
Do you have any idea where our sound clicked out? Should I just pick up with talking about Q?
Yeah. Just go right ahead with the Q.
Okay. All right. So the Q in the LGBTQA refers to queer questioning. It can refer to either gender identity or sexual orientation. Some people identify as gender queer, meaning they don't see themselves as either exclusively masculine or feminine. Or queer can refer to sexual orientation, and it's a term some people prefer instead of lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And questioning for both of those refers to people who are starting to understand themselves, maybe as being transgender or lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but are in kind of the early stages of coming out to themselves. The A can stand for ally or asexual. Ally is someone who supports the well-being and equal treatment for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning community. And asexual is a sexual orientation that we're just beginning to know something about, really, that are people who feel like they're just not particularly interested in sexual relationships. And so they see that their sexual orientation is kind of not being attracted to anyone. And I confess to not knowing a lot about that, but it is a very active community on the internet, I know. All right, so as we talk about these, you'll hear me say LGBTQ, LGBTQA, and then occasionally I'll say sexual minority, which is sort of another summary term for all of those. So being a sexual minority is a risk factor for anxiety disorders, for depression, for suicide attempts, as well as for substance abuse. There are fewer studies that show that being transgender is a risk factor for all of those well, but I think that the data are pretty clear that that is the case for transgender individuals as well. So one of the questions that the research community has asked is this something that's inherent about being gay or trans, or is it something that is caused by another factor? Sort of why do we see that association between anxiety, depression, et cetera, and being a sexual minority? So if something's associated with being gay or trans, it makes it more likely that if you're a member of this community, you'll have one of these problems. And I like to talk about Evelyn Hooker, who some of you may know, who happens to be from North Platte, Nebraska, and I'm speaking to you from Lincoln, Nebraska tonight. Evelyn Hooker was a psychologist who did her work in the middle of the 20th century, and she was one of the first people to demonstrate that being, and the first study she did was with gay men, being a gay man did not inherently mean that you had psychological problems. And she did a very clever study in which she had gay men who were not in therapy of any kind and heterosexual men both complete the best psychological tests of the time, and then had people try to tell who gave the responses. Were the responses on the test from the gay people or from the heterosexual people? And they couldn't tell. And it was really the first kind of evidence that you could be gay, lesbian, or bisexual and still have good psychological health. So we really think that the reason that these sorts of mental health and substance abuse problems show up is not because it's something inherent in being a member of the minority group, but comes from something we call the minority stress. And I put up here Meyer's minority stress model, which some of you may be familiar with. And what this model predicts is kind of well-being or mental health. And you see here, I'll come back to the coping box first in a moment, but you'll see here kind of distal stressors, which means are things not directly related to you, but which are stressful, like hearing about discrimination or hearing about hate crimes. What are called proximal stressors, so those are things specific to you, and I've got a couple of examples here, meaning how out you are, as well as internalized homophobia, which is the extent to which you feel badly about being a sexual minority. And then general life stressors, which are not particular to the LGBTQ community, but are true for all of us. And the more life stressors you have, the lower well-being and mental health you have, the poorer mental health. Similarly, distal stressors and proximal stressors can all add together to have an impact on well-being and mental health. However, that blow can be softened if you have good coping resources and good social support. So you see social support come in here, kind of moderating the effects of these. So I'm going to talk a bit about this coping social support box and then work my way through these other two as well to give you a sense about how we think that the risk factor for anxiety, depression, substance abuse, et cetera, shows up in this community.
Dr. Hope, I have a question about, you're referring to all the research showing that anxiety and depression and risk of suicide are higher for gay and transgender people.
Mm-hmm.
How much higher is it? Is it like double? Is it a little bit higher? What does the research indicate?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. Depending on the specific disorder you're looking at and depending on the sample, there's always all those caveats that you put in there. It is by no means the case that most people in the community are suffering from one of those problems. But if you see rates of some of the anxiety disorders, it's often something like 2 or 3 times as high in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community compared to the heterosexual community or an unscreened sample. So it is the case that just like most people are healthy, most gay and lesbian people are healthy, but there is some elevated risk. And again, it depends on the specifics, but probably 2 to 3 times as high is probably a good estimate.
So that's pretty dramatic.
It is pretty dramatic. All right?
Yeah, thank you.
So just so you know, Neil, I can't see the questions, so I will have to pause for them. Okay.
Okay.
Times as high a suicide rate? Is that what you said?
Okay. All right, so I want to talk first about the coping and social support. Oops, if I can take through my slide here. So even with many stressors, people can really thrive if they have good coping skills and plenty of social support. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of general coping strategies, and then we'll talk about some sexual minority specific ones. So just like our mom told us, those general coping strategies like a healthy diet.
The conference is in lecture mode.
Neil, I just got a
go ahead.
Okay, all right. So just like our mom told us, those general coping strategies like a healthy diet, adequate sleep, and exercise are very helpful in managing the stressors that are part of life as well as part of being in a minority group. Also learning to express feelings appropriately, using good emotional coping is very important. Cognitive self-help skills are very helpful, and these are the kinds of things that people learn if they have any treatment for anxiety or depression or stress management, things like avoiding expecting the worst, avoiding catastrophizing. And then increasingly, I'm sure most of you are aware, the role of mindfulness in well-being is increasingly recognized, and I think that's true as well here. If we start looking at LGBTQ specific coping strategies, one of the first ones I want to talk about is really recognizing experiences of bias and discrimination and having the strategies to manage them. So having some skills to either confront bias or discrimination if people experience it or not, depending on the appropriateness and the safety in the moment. One thing that people have talked about being different for the LGBTQ community as a minority compared to, for example, the African American community is there's pretty good evidence that African American families teach their children to cope with discrimination and bias because they see their parents cope with it, they talk to them about how to handle it, and they have a similar kind of experience. Most LGBTQ folks come from heterosexual families who have not faced anti-gay or anti-trans bias. So it really takes some effort on the part of the community to work with each other to learn how to manage that. Also, people might make choices about where to live and work to be in more accepting environments and kind of balancing priorities there. So maybe it'd be great to live close to your family, but it would be even better to live in a place that was more gay-friendly, for example. Continuing with LGBTQA-specific strategies, I think finding mental health providers who have good multicultural competencies around LGBTQA's concerns is very, very important. One of those competencies involves distinguishing between emotional responses that are distorted versus realistic perceptions. So I do a lot of work with social anxiety, and socially anxious individuals are often worried about speaking with their boss because they're worried about getting fired. My boss is going to fire me and I won't be able to find another job. If you're a member of the LGBTQ community, it is possible that there are no legal protections for discrimination in employment, and that your boss can fire you for being gay. And so the therapist needs to be kind of aware of those dimensions and help the client distinguish between what might be distorted and what might be realistic. So just an example of some competencies there.
So a good therapist would want to get a lot of detail to try to make that distinction. Is it something that is just an anxiety-related thought, or is it actually realistic? Could it actually be a realistic risk
Yes.
of being fired?
Yes, exactly. And I think a lot of anxiety therapists immediately assume that it's distorted because that's kind of the heart of what's happening a lot of times in anxiety. And when you're working with somebody from any minority group, but particularly this one, sometimes those fears are more realistic, and it takes a little bit of sophistication to notice that.
How common is that as a realistic concern today in 2015?
Mm-hmm.
Is it still pretty widespread as it used to be, or is it...
It is. I mean, it depends to a certain extent on what part of the country you're in.
Yeah, okay.
I will tell you that there were headlines in the newspaper here this past week about a teacher losing their job because they were gay. There's a national survey of trans people that show, I'm trying to remember the specific statistic, but somewhere between 40 and 60% of people have experienced overt discrimination, like losing a job, being refused medical services, being kicked out of housing.
And you're talking about trans?
About trans, yeah.
Okay.
LGBT
so very prevalent discrimination against transgender people.
But it is still very much the same for lesbians and gays. It is sometimes, I think, more underground. People are kind of let go and the reasons not explained. But there's reason to think that it might be because of their sexual orientation. But yes, it does still happen. In most places in the country, it is not illegal. There's no reason, and there's no protection and no recourse. When we look at the social support side of things, the research shows that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folks get less social support from their families than heterosexual or cisgender people. Cisgender may be a term you're not familiar with there. It means people who are not transgender, so it's kind of the trans side of heterosexual. Social support is really crucial to protect us from anxiety and depression, health problems, substance abuse. It's a very important factor in health and well-being to have people that you can count on, people that you can talk to for emotional support, as well as practical things like someone to pick you up and take you to get your car when it's done at the repair shop, and those kind of very basic things. So often for gay and lesbian people, they need to develop a supportive community of people that are not necessarily their biological family. And in the community, it's talked about as the family that you choose. But that requires often some active work to seek out organizations or community centers or friendly religious community that will help you develop that group of people that you can count on and act like family if your biological family, your family of origin, is not supportive or not available. All right, so we talked about the coping and social support part of this. I want to talk a little bit now about kind of the distal stressors, and I'm just going to do kind of one or two slides on that so that I can get on to talking about outness, which is one of the pieces I want to spend a bit more time on tonight. So distal events mean things are not immediately present for you, but come from living in a stigmatizing environment. And stigma is the kind of technical psychologist definition is a characteristic that society agrees is less valued, is inferior, or you can think of it as like having some sort of stain on your person, on sort of a mark of inferiority. And it is the case that even with a lot of progress having been made, identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and ally carries a stigma that can take an emotional toll over time. Most people, even if they're fairly progressive, still have a little bit of this sense that it's not quite as okay to be gay as it is to be straight. So how do you manage dealing with this? One thing you could do is you can kind of limit your exposure to it by surrounding yourself with people who disagree with the stigma as much as possible, as well as avoiding excessive exposure to media accounts. It's very easy to see and hear a lot about hate crimes and politicians making outrageous anti-gay statements, and you can really find a lot of that on the internet, and people can get caught up in reading about it a lot, and that can be really emotionally traumatizing over time. So often it's helpful for people to be aware and informed, but to not expose themselves to that more than they need to. And then one of the best kind of antidotes to the stigma is really empowerment, to try to work for change. Get actively involved in organizations or as an individual to help make things better. If you're working in a company, to try to get policy changed, if you're a member of an organization, to try to get change. But this also has kind of an emotional cost, because we may feel like we're ultimately winning the war here, but there certainly are battles to be lost, and those are painful. So I think it's still important to remember to have some balance. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about distal stressors. I want to talk in proximal stressors mostly about outness. Internalized homophobia is kind of when you take that stigma into yourself, and we know that that is associated with some greater risk for some mental health problems and such, but I want to, the opposite side of that is outness, so I'm going to spend more time talking about outness. So what's outness? Outness really has two parts. One part is probably what you think of as outness, which is disclosure, an active indication of your sexual orientation or gender identity. So an example of this is about a week ago I was at an event where I met a new faculty member at the university that I hadn't met before, and we were chatting along, and she said to me, oh, my partner works at this local insurance agency, and she really likes her job, and goes on to talk a bit about it. And in that event, she came out to me. She disclosed that she is in a relationship with a woman. So that's kind of active disclosure. Concealment is avoiding disclosure on an ongoing basis. So it's kind of the flip side of it. So in this case, if she had concealed, she would have either not mentioned the gender of her partner, not said anything about her partner, or even pretended that her partner was male as a way to kind of not come out to me. So concealment is kind of that active avoidance and hiding. And both of those can be going on. And researchers typically use these interchangeably, but as you'll see, there's some reasons to separate them. So being out in any way has costs and benefits. I'm going to put all this up here for you to see. So the cost of being out, that you're at greater risk as a youth for being bullied, you're at greater risk for hate crimes, you risk being rejected by people, you risk losing your job, housing, status, opportunities, educational opportunities. So there are costs of people finding out. On the other side, and there are benefits for being out. And the research shows that people who are out have lower levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. You see that little asterisk there about how it's reversed. If you look at 20 to 30 years ago, especially, it was the opposite. People who were more out had higher levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. But as stigma has decreased, it's been healthier to be out rather than healthier to not be out. So this interesting kind of change there. People who are out have more social support, have better physical health, and also have an impact on changing public attitudes about LGBTQ people. So one of the things that research has shown will help people who have anti-gay bias to change their bias, to change their beliefs, is to get to know someone personally who's lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So if they have that personal relationship, they start to see them more as people, and they start to change their attitudes. So just being out is sort of an act of social change.
Dr. Hope, you just said something that I found very interesting that I thought maybe you could say another word or two about.
Okay.
That you were talking about the whether it's healthy from an anxiety, depression, and stress standpoint to be out or to not be out. And you said something very interesting that has reversed.
Mm-hmm.
What did you say in the last 10 or 20 years?
Yes, if you look at the older research, 70s, 80s, even into kind of the beginning of the 90s or so, it tended to show that people were not doing so well. But that has just kind of gradually flipped. And we think it's probably because back in the 70s and 80s, there was so much stigma associated with being gay that people who were out were really had to kind of be on the fringe of society, and there were really high costs for them. So as that has switched and it's become more accepted, it's better to not have to hide who you are as long as society has any degree of acceptance at all.
So now what you're saying is that current research shows that it's actually psychologically healthy.
Yes.
And lowers anxiety, depression, and stress in general.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes. So it is better to be authentic. It's healthier. Okay, good question. Thanks for jumping in there.
Sure.
Now, outness isn't a one-time event, and this is another thing that therapists who are more multiculturally trained and sensitive to working with the community understand that it's an ongoing process to yourself. So for somebody who's coming to understand themselves as lesbian or trans, you start to think about it. You start to think it might be true. Then you think, well, maybe I'm not so sure. Maybe it's a phase. But over time, you come to understand what it means for yourself, as well as then as you enter new phases, like you start your first relationship or you get married to someone. There's a kind of ongoing process. And also as an ongoing process and with each new person and new situation in terms of disclosing to people and deciding whether or not you're going to share. Now, remember we just divided outness into disclosure and concealment. I want to talk a bit more about concealment now. As you might think, as was popped up at the bottom of that slide there, is it better to conceal a stigma if you can? So if you have a stigma, you have this kind of stain, wouldn't it be better not to let people know about it? Well, it turns out that that sort of constant vigilance and preoccupation really affects how you think in each situation. You have to think about who knows, who suspects, what might happen if they find out or I tell them. So there's a level of vigilance there. And this comes from the work of John Pachenkas, who's a great researcher who's thought a lot about concealment. It also impacts how you act in each situation. You have to kind of monitor yourself this is particularly true for gay men. They often have been kind of bullied and stigmatized and be called a sissy and all sorts of other things early in their life. And so they work on acting straight if they're trying to conceal their identity. So they might think when they sit, oh, I better make sure that I cross my legs at my ankle rather than my knee so that I look more masculine. Certainly, you're not going to do any public displays of affection with your partner. You don't want to slip up on the pronouns when you're talking about who you spent time with this weekend. So you really have to monitor your speech and your behavior. And sometimes that leads to people kind of isolating themselves to avoid discovery, kind of being quiet and not participating in situations. And also, concealment can impact how you feel in each situation. So that process of concealment makes you feel anxious and depressed. It can make you feel demoralized. You feel ashamed. If you're hiding the stigma, it's something to be ashamed of. And then maybe you feel guilty about not sharing who you really are, about what people would think if they found out that you've been lying all this time about who you are. And the situations that you're in can be easier or more difficult depending on how salient the stigma is. So if you're in a situation where everyone's talking about their relationships and what they did this weekend, then you're really more focused on the need to be concealing, and so there's more stress associated. Other sort of neutral conversations might be okay. Maybe someone tells an anti-gay joke or a trans joke. Then immediately that's more stressful as you're trying to figure out, like, do I speak up or not? How do I handle that? That's really about me. What if they found out about me? People may then start to gravitate towards situations that are easier where the stigma is less salient. And just like avoidance in anxiety can have a huge impact on your life, that can be the case here as well, that people might change where they work, they might limit their academic achievement to stay in situations that are safer. So in many ways, this process of concealment can be very much like the process that people experience when they're having problems with anxiety, where they might avoid situations because they're afraid of having a panic attack, or socially anxious people might avoid situations where they might embarrass themselves. So the cost of concealment is that it impacts how you think, feel, and act in many situations. It creates constant monitoring of yourself in the situation, and it may limit the situation you enter, which can limit your social relationships, interpersonal intimacy, and getting social support. Let me put that up for just a moment here so people have a chance to read it. So we have done a little bit of research on outness, and especially distinguishing between disclosure and concealment. The next slide I'm going to put up tells a little bit about one of our studies, and I'm not going to bore you with the scientific details of the study. But I want to just kind of point out the results here. Whoops. So we have a measure of outness that we're calling the Nebraska Outness Scale that separates disclosure and concealment. And we gave it to 151 individuals who identified as gay or lesbian. And we found that greater concealment, so the more you tried to conceal and hide your orientation, the lower your quality of life, the more fear of negative evaluation, and some of you may recognize that as the core feature of social anxiety. And the less social support people had. And remember, social support is an important protective factor for health and well-being. Now, there was some relationship between disclosure and some of these measures, but it turns out that concealment is really the important part of outness in terms of health and well-being.
So just when you talked about concealment before, you made a reference to being vigilant, and that kind of reminds me of characteristics of a lot of the anxiety conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It is very much like that characteristic, the anxiety disorders, where you're sort of, there we usually talk about hypervigilance for some sort of danger or negative evaluation, your feared situation, whether it's in panic or a specific phobia. So that kind of vigilance that is stressful and kind of drives how you process information. That same thing is probably happening here, where people have something that they don't want people to find out about, that has risk if they find out, and so people are kind of monitoring and being vigilant in a pretty similar way probably, which may be part of, you know, that kind of same process that creates the risk for anxiety disorders. Although I will say that's speculative on my part. There's no data for that. All right, so we talked about the costs and benefits potentially of being out, and I've kind of talked about the benefits, but haven't really talked about what do you do about these costs, because being out does have real costs. And I would argue that being out also helps reduce these costs because it works to change attitudes, laws, and policies. As people are more out, more people get to know them, it starts to change attitudes and will lead to those societal change, which then makes it safer to be out and reduces those costs. So I had said a bit ago that being out is a bit of a kind of social justice activity in and of itself, and that it can help lead to societal change. So let's look at the implications of this a little bit here. So I've mostly talked about what it means to be out as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender individual, you know, so just disclosing who you really are. I'm assuming that probably some of the people listening would identify more as being an ally, and an ally meaning someone who supports fair treatment and equal rights for the LGBTQ community. So being out as an ally can also carry some of these same risks in terms of people sort of challenging you about whether that's the right thing to do. You face some of the same kind of backlash if you speak up potentially, and it can sometimes be easier to just, you know, conceal your identity as an ally and not speak up when somebody shares that anti-gay joke or that, you know, trans joke, or says something about Bruce Jenner that they think is funny but is really stigmatizing. Similarly, as a parent or family member, it can be easier to be quiet about your family member who's lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So most of the research is really on gays and lesbians, but there likely are some similar effects for transgender folks, and there's some data on that. Less data on parents and allies, but probably some of the same processes are operating. So my challenge to you as an LGBTQ person, or as an ally, or as a parent or family member, you can choose whether or not to disclose in a given situation. Sometimes it's not relevant. Sometimes it's not any of your business. You don't have to disclose to the, you know, the bank teller when you're going there and doing some sort of transaction, or to the person who's waiting on you at the restaurant, perhaps. But there are places where it does make sense, because actively concealing is bad for you. So I would urge people to consider practicing authenticity, which means that when it's relevant and appropriate, to come out rather than to conceal. So I have an example here for, in response to what did you do this weekend? A lesbian woman might say, my girlfriend and I went to the movie, rather than my friend and I went to the movie. A parent might say, my son's boyfriend joined us for dinner, rather than my son and his friend, or my son and his roommate joined us for dinner. Or an ally might say, I went to a presentation that will help me be more supportive of my trans coworker. Coming out is with the message that, yes, it is important to be supportive of the trans coworker. So as we start to wind down here, my take-home message is that the stressors that come with identifying as LGBTQA create greater risk for anxiety and depression. We can reduce those risks with good coping strategies, gathering strong social support, coming out in a healthy and safe way. And as allies, we can provide non-judgmental social support. We can help change the laws and attitudes to reduce the stigma. And we can help the LGBTQ individuals around us that we care about to stop concealing identity, because it's good for them, it's good for their well-being, and it's likely good for all of us because it helps reduce stigma for everyone. Well, I didn't think that was the next slide. So I had a slide that said I wanted to thank my students and the researchers whose work that I cited here, including Greg Herrick, Rich Savin-Williams, John Pachankas, and Ian Meyer, and also thank ADAA for this opportunity. So I think we have a few minutes for questions, maybe?
Yeah, so please type in a question if you'd like to bring up a question for Dr. Hope. You can see the right side of your panel. Just click in that little box, type in your question. Only Dr. Hope and I can see the question. And while we're waiting for a question, I had a question. Can you say a little bit more about social support? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person, how would they go about getting social support if they're not getting a lot of support currently?
If they're not, yeah, because often people become isolated from their families. There's, you know, a risk of being really rejected and kicked out of your family, especially for youth. Sometimes here at the university we see college students who don't want to come out to their family because they're afraid that they'll quit paying for school. So people can be limited in their access to support from their family. So it really involves trying to find a group of friends who are open and supportive of you being authentic and of the path that you're on as you sort of discover who you are and the direction that you're going. In most places there are organizations like PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. High schools nowadays very often have gay-straight alliances. There are often social justice organizations that are working on LGBTQ issues where people can kind of start to get to know some people where they know it's going to be safe to be out. Certainly a lot of religious communities get stigmatized for being anti-gay, and a lot of them are, but there are also a lot of religious communities that are very open and supportive. And if you look around a bit, you can often find something that fits, and that can be a great place to get support as well. And people often say, oh, but I'm not that religious, and I'm like, yeah, a lot of people there aren't that religious either. They're just going for the social support, and that's okay. So, you know, if people can find some place that they're comfortable, that's often a good source as well. And then just other things you might care about, like, you know, if you're passionate about the environment, look for a progressive pro-environmental group. They're likely to be progressive on other issues as well.
And how would somebody know that they're doing a good job in providing that support for themselves? Any benchmarks that is it just putting a certain amount of time into it, or feeling like you have people you can can see or talk to or
Yeah.
be authentic with?
No, that's a great question, because it turns out that the research on social support tells us that it's not the actual number of people you have, but whether you perceive that you have support. So there are elaborate questionnaires for evaluating social support, but you can also evaluate it with a couple of items that say things like, if you need something, do you have somebody you can talk to? If you have something stressful going on, is there someone you can share it with? And if the answer to that is yes, and you can name a couple of specific people or even one specific person sometimes, that might be sufficient. Some people need bigger networks, some people.
Even one or two people.
Even one or two people can be sufficient for some people. Now, some people need bigger networks, so it's really how much your perceived satisfaction that matters.
Here's a comment from one of our audience that is just thanking you for the presentation, and she says her daughter identifies as trans and also has bipolar, and the presentation has helped her understand the extra stress and the additional sources of anxiety. So she just is thanking you for giving her that insight. Here's an interesting question. Are there benefits to choosing to conceal?
Are there benefits to choosing to conceal?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are if you're in a place, you're in a situation or circumstances that aren't safe. So there certainly are places in the world where you want to conceal because you're probably going to die if you don't. I mean, there are still countries around the world where imprisonment and death are a definite possibility if people find out you're LGBT. So certainly in those kinds of situations, it makes sense to conceal. In most places, probably in the United States, that's not such a factor, although there probably are certain families, certain pockets, certain companies you might work for where there are great risks of coming out, and you'd really want to be prepared to handle what those risks are before you came out. So if the risks are obvious and important, then I think, yes, it does make sense to conceal until you can get yourself in a better circumstance.
Dr. Hope, would you say that the workplace environment is a special category on this? Are there, I get questions from people about, is it okay to be open in their workplace about having an anxiety disorder?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's that stigma that attaches.
The stigma that goes with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a clear answer. I'll say, well, each work situation is different. You need to think it through carefully.
Mm-hmm.
What thoughts do you have in general about this concealment versus outness in the workplace?
And I think we can speak of that more generally for having an anxiety disorder, having depression. I think the data are just really clear that the extent to which you can be authentic and not have major costs is always better. So I think your answer to people like it depends on your workplace does make a difference. Is there going to be a big cost at your workplace for saying that you're gay or saying that you have panic disorder, and each person has to balance that. But to the extent that people can be open, I think it's always better because then you don't have to hide it. And you are likely to find somebody else who says, oh my gosh, I have that too. What has been helpful for you? And you get kind of more support than maybe you expected.
Here's a great, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Here's another great question. In terms of getting psychotherapy for anxiety or depression, are there differences in how anxiety or depression would be treated in therapy in the LGBTQ population versus the straight population?
Yeah, I think absolutely there are differences. We kind of say that when you're gay or lesbian and you're in therapy, everything is about being gay and lesbian, and nothing is about being gay and lesbian. So it is important in lots of ways, but everything isn't about being a sexual minority. So mostly, for example, if I treat somebody who's trans and has panic disorder, mostly we treat panic disorder in exactly the same way that we treat it for everyone else, with kind of standard exposure, cognitive skills, medication, whatever we're going to do. But we also keep in mind that there might be other things that are impacting it. So there might be stressors related to being trans that are making it more likely somebody panics in a certain situation or makes them at greater risk for it. We also might think for the trans population that if people are taking hormones, that might be interacting with any medication or might be changing their emotional responses in a way that they haven't learned to cope with yet. So I would say it's always the same and it's always different.
Good answer. Now here's a question from a member of our audience who's a therapist.
Oh, good.
And the therapist writes, if you're working with a client who's a member of the LGBTQ community, do you have any recommendations about how to bring up the issue of outness?
So they haven't come out to you, but you suspect they are.
Or maybe they have come out to the therapist, but are not. They're concealing.
Or concealing otherwise. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think is important for therapists to do is to really make sexual orientation and gender identity part of the demographics you get right at the beginning. So if your clients are coming to your office and they're filling out any of your forms, they should have an opportunity to disclose their gender identity and their sexual orientation right there. And we never assume that people are cisgender and straight. We routinely ask everybody. So then it comes out right away.
Just like a routine question like male, female, age.
Right. How old are you? And then we ask people, we actually have a paper form that says male, female, transgender, and then has a blank for them to write in about that. We also have a blank for sexual orientation, so people can write exactly what they want there. Or if it's an interview, we just ask, we say we don't assume anything about anybody. If you were to date, would you date men, women, both? You know, when I'm doing a social anxiety assessment, that's how I ask that.
You make it as part of your intake.
Yep.
And then once you have that information, then it would be just kind of flow a lot more easily to bring up that issue. You know?
Right.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. And then if people are not out or they're, having struggles that you think might be related to their status as a sexual minority, then I think it's a kind of some psychoeducation about the risk benefits of that, but being very respectful of the fact that people understand their life and their life circumstances, and they have to make the judgment about how safe it is for them to be out and do that cost-benefit analysis for themselves.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hope. It was just a really wonderful presentation. And I want to thank everybody for attending. We hope it was helpful and interesting. And I want to invite you to let friends and family know about our webinar series. So bye for now, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
You will now be disconnected by the moderator.